What's up guys, and welcome back to the channel, where in this video we will be covering the character of Rey in the Star Wars sequel trilogy and discussing some new details regarding her lineage and some probable misconceptions that have recently risen due to a new revelation that was made about a couple of the other major characters in the Skywalker saga. Now, in the Rise of Skywalker, we learned that Rey was the granddaughter of Darth Sidious, stashed away on a backwater desert world as a little girl to keep her hidden from her sinister grandfather, who would have otherwise molded the young Rey into a deadly Sith assassin. This reveal, along with the Dyad Rey formed with Ben Solo, helped some fans to make sense of Rey's rapidly increasing power in the previous two movies. The idea that these two prodigal children, the descendants of two of the most dynastic lineages in the history of the galaxy, had been bound together as one in the Force was a concept that I fell in love with. And I think Rey's infamous lineage only adds to the meaning behind the Force Dyad. Now, in this book, Skywalker, A Family at War, which we have referenced quite a few times now, we get a little more on the specifics of Rey's father, how he came to be, and ultimately the sad and lonely childhood that his offspring would inevitably endure due to his background. But before we get into that, I also want to shed a little light on a potentially very odd proposition Lucasfilm could find themselves in if they played this thing terribly wrong, which, allow me to state for the record, I do not actually think is going to happen. So, in Marvel's Darth Vader comic, we recently learned that Palpatine was, at the very least, attempting to use DNA extracted from the severed hand of Luke Skywalker in his cloning laboratory on Exegol. This would obviously imply that there is a possibility that Palpatine's son may have had a little bit of that Skywalker blood flowing through his veins, which would then intrinsically mean that Rey too was a Skywalker, not only by declaration at the end of the Rise of Skywalker, but now by blood thanks to the work of her late grandfather. And obviously that would create some unnecessary drama and really just an overall odd situation considering Rey's connection with Ben Solo and their love for one another, which they finally open up about and fully acknowledge by the story's end. However, I have good news regarding that. First of all, this same book actually plainly states that Rey is not a Skywalker by blood, but that she embodied some of the Skywalker family's best characteristics. But if that's not enough to debunk this theory on its own, there is also the obvious fact that just because Luke Skywalker's hand was in the laboratory does not mean it was used in the creation of Rey's father. We have to keep in mind that Palpatine is executing test run after test run with different doses of various DNA samples. He's trying to create this perfect clone, not only to host his own spirit should he be faced with a situation that called for him to abandon his true body, but also to potentially create a new apprentice, both while Darth Vader was around and after he was long gone. And who knows what else he had planned. So there is really no reason for us to conclude that Rey is now genetically linked to the Skywalkers in any way, and considering the events of the sequel trilogy, that sort of revelation would really make no sense whatsoever. But now that we have that out of the way, let's take this deeper dive into Rey's childhood and her father's journey. Rey's biological father was the offshoot of Palpatine's genetic research. Not precisely a clone, but made of cloned tissue and donated cells. His name has been lost to time, as has the reason the young man survived, whether by purpose or neglect. There is no record that the son of Palpatine demonstrated any of the Force abilities that his cruel and powerful father relished. Considering Sheev Palpatine's history, that would have undoubtedly made the boy a disappointment to the man who sired him. Now, a lot of this little excerpt here was already common knowledge for some, but it makes things pretty easy for us to understand and break down. Basically, what this is saying is that Palpatine's son escaped from Exegol, went and found this woman, whoever Rey's mother is, and then they had Rey. And when Palpatine finds out about Rey and learns that she has inherited his sensitivity to the Force, finding her obviously becomes his top priority. And it's at that point, presumably after spending some time scrambling and on the run from Palpatine's hunters and assassins, that Rey is left on Jakku and her parents are killed by Ochi of Bestoon. And that leads me to this next quote from the book, which I'm going to paraphrase a little, but I want to look at a few lines because it really jogs my mind and points to some parallels between Rey and Ben Solo as they grow up worlds apart from one another, but are inherently and directly affected by one another's experiences due to their bond. So this reading starts off by saying, like Ben, for much of her life, Rey had no knowledge of her bloodline. And the same goes for Ben, of course. We covered that reality a while back about how Ben actually didn't learn that he was the grandson of Darth Vader until he was 23 years old. But the reason that I point that out is it's interesting to look at the similar effect, actually, that had on each one of them when they did finally learn the truth about their lineage. But then we go on from there. Rey only remembered her father and mother as shadows. The sensation of feeling loved and cared for remained, but she had no memory of their faces, their names, or the sacrifices they had made to keep her safe. For many years, Rey consoled herself with the thought that one day they would return to find her. So again, this excerpt here really isn't telling us anything we don't already know, but what I want to point out here is how Rey is able to hold on to these memories of feeling loved by her parents, which is something that she remembers and believes up to and through the end of the sequel trilogy. While in contrast, we have Ben Solo, who grew up in what many outsiders would perceive as a wonderful family to be a part of, but instead was overwhelmed and bombarded by feelings of mistrust and betrayal. In his mind, he's treated as this boy who even his own family believes is destined for evil. And with Palpatine lurking in his subconscious from the very beginning, the events of his life are orchestrated in such a way that Ben would almost be crazy not to believe that his family and the galaxy may be right about him, that he is destined for darkness. And eventually, once he's given no choice, once he's pushed over the proverbial edge by Luke and welcomed by Snoke with open arms, he's sort of like, alright, obviously this is what I'm supposed to do, so it's time to let old things die. And he begins this downward spiral. But my point in saying all of this is, well, there's 2 points actually. First, I think there is a really intriguing take-home message here, which is simply that everything is not always what it seems, and sometimes less is more. Rey has no concrete memories of her parents. She was abandoned on Jakku and essentially raised herself for a decade and a half. She was beaten down and hardened by a harsh desert landscape in a world where scavenging for survival is the way of life. And yet, she grows up to be this hopeful, optimistic, loving young woman. And then we have Ben, who is raised in royalty, and for those who don't have an insight into the Solo's personal life, it's reasonable to assume that he has no life-threatening pressures, that his family will give him all of the love and attention he could ever ask for to be successful, that things will just come easy for him. And the reality is that this couldn't be further from the truth. So again, more is not always better. Sometimes simplicity and this reality that you have to fight every day to survive can give a character or even a real-life person the upper hand in this roundabout sort of way. And the second potential message I want to point out is that this whole idea that we've just covered here supports a theory that I presented a while back regarding why Ben Solo was eventually dragged to the dark side while Rey was easily able to remain in the light right up until Ben Solo's return to the light. But the theory is essentially that the reason Rey had such a strong affinity for the light side of the Force is that throughout her challenging and lonely childhood, Ben was subconsciously taking on Rey's pain and dark sensations. The events of his childhood, coupled with Palpatine's ongoing presence within his mind, have fed his inner turmoil, causing him to take on the darkness, while Rey, whose very existence is largely unknown and whose potential to wield the Force is untapped, holds on to the light. And as Ben falls further into the darkness, Rey unknowingly leans further toward the light. So rather than the Force being relatively balanced within each of them, the pull in one direction causes the other to pull back in the opposite direction. And then notice how in the Rise of Skywalker, when Ben Solo begins his climb back to the light, Rey almost immediately experiences her darkest moments. And it's only once they come together and fully acknowledge and embrace their oneness that they are both finally freed from that conflict. As the Dyad becomes one in the Force, now on the same page with one another, they unlock this sense of clarity and connection that had eluded them to this point. But what are your guys' thoughts on this? Personally, I feel that the tragedy of Ben Solo's life as we know it right now is probably one of the saddest stories there is, at least in regards to movies and cinema and storytelling, of course. But at the same time, the story of Rey and Ben Solo is a beautiful one, where these two heroes struggling to find their place in the galaxy, initially pitted against one another as enemies, eventually find their purpose in one another. It's only once they come together that they truly find themselves, and as we continue continue to gain more insight into this backstory, it all just makes more and more sense to me. But I look forward to hearing your thoughts on these ideas in the comments section below, so drop a comment and let me know what you guys think. Please remember to give this video a like if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel if you're new, and of course, may the Force be with you always.